Officials pulled the car aside after the run, not because it broke, not because it crashed, but because something about the way it left the line didn't sit right with them. It launched too clean, it carried too much speed through the traps, and when they got their hands on the body panels, something felt wrong before a single measurement was even taken. They weighed it, they remeasured it, they ran their hands along the quarter panels and felt something that shouldn't have been there, or rather, something that wasn't there anymore. Steel that should have had weight and substance felt thin enough to flex under a thumb, the kind of give you'd expect from a tin can. Not a body panel that had supposedly rolled off a factory production line unchanged. This was supposed to be a stock-bodied pro-stock car. What officials were holding in their hands felt more like a shell of one hollowed out from the inside, in a way no measuring tape could fully capture. The man behind the car just watched, arms crossed, saying nothing. He'd been through this before. He knew exactly what they were going to find, and he knew exactly how little they'd be able to do about it, because he'd already thought 3 steps ahead of whatever question they were about to ask him. Around him, other crews had already stopped what they were doing to watch. This wasn't the first time officials had pulled a car aside for a closer look. It was the first time they'd looked this uneasy doing it. This is the story of Dyno Don Nicholson's acid-dipped Ford Maverick. The car's so light it made NHRA officials stop a race weekend to investigate it. And the trick that pushed the boundaries of what legal actually meant in 1970s pro-stock racing, by the end of this video you'll understand exactly how a body panel goes from steel to something closer to foil, why officials couldn't definitively stop it, and why this single car changed how NHRA inspected every pro-stock machine that came after it. Number 1. To understand why anyone would trust Don Nicholson with a trick this bold, you have to understand the reputation he'd already built, long before the Maverick ever rolled onto an NHRA starting line. Nicholson earned the nickname Dyno Don for his mastery of the chassis dynamometer, a skill that set him apart from most drivers of his era, who tuned largely by feel and by ear. Nicholson tuned by data, running engines on the dyno for hours at a stretch, chasing fractions of horsepower that other crews simply didn't have the patience, the equipment, or the discipline to pursue with the same rigor. That background, as much scientist as driver, is exactly what made him such a natural fit for Ford's factory experimental program in the 1960s, where he'd already made a name for himself campaigning Cammer-powered Comets and Mustangs at speeds that regularly embarrassed rival factory teams. Nicholson had spent years running mid-10-second passes at speeds approaching 135 miles an hour, experimenting relentlessly with induction setups, chasing every last fraction of a second the equipment in front of him had to give. That was a driver who never treated a race car as a finished product. He treated it as an ongoing experiment, one that never stopped evolving between rounds, between race weekends, between entire seasons. By the time pro-stock racing emerged as its own class, in the early 1970s, Nicholson had already spent a decade building a reputation as one of the sport's sharpest technical minds, someone who treated every car not just as a machine to be driven, but as a problem to be solved, down to the smallest possible detail. He wasn't the loudest personality in the garage area. He wasn't the driver giving fiery interviews or courting controversy for its own sake. He was the quiet, methodical one. The one other crew chiefs kept half an eye on, because whatever Nicholson showed up with at the next event usually turned out to be a preview of where the entire class was eventually headed. Nicholson's transition from factory experimental to pro-stock wasn't just a change of class. It was, in a lot of ways, a natural next step for exactly the kind of mind he'd already proven himself to have. Factory experimental had rewarded drivers who could find the outer edge of what a factory-backed car could become. Pro-stock, with its tighter rules around production-based bodies and weight, demanded an even more precise, even more surgical approach to finding an edge, and Nicholson, if anything, seemed built for that shift rather than challenged by it. Pro-stock in this era was, in theory, meant to be a class rooted in production-based cars, real street models, modified within a defined set of rules, racing on a level playing field. In practice, it quickly became a different kind of battlefield entirely. Every serious team understood that the class rulebook, like any rulebook, had gaps. Weight rules, engine placement rules, body specification rules. All of it had been written with good intentions and limited foresight, because nobody drafting a rulebook can anticipate every single way a determined engineer might try to bend it. And the teams that found those gaps first and exploited them most aggressively were the teams that ended up in the winner's circle. Nicholson, with his dyno-obsessed, detail-driven mind, was never going to be a driver who left an obvious gap like that sitting on the table for someone else to find first. Number 2. By the early 1970s, one of the open secrets circulating through pro-stock garages was a process called acid dipping. The concept itself wasn't complicated, at least not on the surface. Teams would take a car's steel body panels, doors, hoods, fenders, quarter panels, sometimes even structural sections, and submerge them in vats of acid solution. The acid would eat away at the metal's surface, gradually thinning it from the inside out, shedding weight that would otherwise be sitting uselessly on a car that was trying to accelerate as hard and as fast as physically possible down a quarter-mile of pavement. Weight is the enemy of acceleration in any form of drag racing, and pro stock in particular was a class where every single pound mattered enormously because the rules restricted so many other variables: engine displacement, wheelbase, body configuration, that weight reduction became one of the few remaining levers teams could pull to gain a genuine competitive edge. A body panel that weighed half of what it should have, while still technically being the same steel panel that came off the factory production line, was about as close to a free lunch as pro stock racing offered in this era. No rulebook change required, no engine displacement pushed past its limit, just a lighter version of the exact same part everyone else was already running. The problem was precision. Leave a panel in the acid vat too briefly, and you'd barely shave off any meaningful weight. A wasted effort that left you no better off than a team running a heavier, untreated body, and worse off in terms of the time and money spent on a process that hadn't paid for itself. Leave it in too long, and the acid didn't discriminate about when to stop. It kept eating, thinning the metal further and further until what remained was barely holding its shape, let alone contributing any real structural integrity to the car around it. Crew chiefs pulling panels from these tanks were making judgment calls with genuinely serious stakes attached. Push too far, and you'd built a car that might not survive a hard landing off the starting line, let alone an actual crash into a guardrail at well over 100 miles an hour. There was no gauge for this. No dial that told a crew chief exactly when to pull a panel out of the tank. It came down to instinct, experience, and a willingness to tap a panel with a knuckle. Listen to the sound it made, and trust your own judgment about whether it had reached the sweet spot between meaningfully lighter and dangerously fragile. Different shops reportedly developed their own closely guarded techniques and timing, treating the exact acid concentration and dip duration almost like a proprietary recipe, something you didn't share freely with a rival team, even if you were on friendly terms in the pits. Some crews are said to have kept detailed logs of dip times and resulting weight measurements, refining the process across multiple cars the same way. A chemist would refine a formula through repeated trials, adjusting concentration and duration by small increments each time. This is exactly the kind of high-precision, high-risk process that fit Nicholson's dyno-driven mindset perfectly. He wasn't the kind of crew chief who'd eyeball a panel and guess. By most accounts of teams working in this era, Nicholson approached acid dipping the same obsessive way he approached engine tuning, testing, measuring, refining, pushing the process as far as it could reasonably go without crossing into outright structural failure. If there was a way to extract another few pounds of weight savings out of a panel through careful, methodical experimentation, Nicholson was exactly the kind of mind who'd find it, document it, and quietly apply it to the next car before anyone else in the garage area had even started asking the right questions. And when Nicholson's Ford Maverick rolled up to the line in this configuration, it wasn't just light. It was light enough that officials themselves started to wonder if something had gone too far. Light enough that a routine glance from an inspector turned into a full stop and investigate moment in the middle of a race weekend. Number 3. The story that's followed Don Nicholson for more than 50 years centers on exactly how far his acid-dipped Maverick body actually went, according to garage legend that's circulated through the sport ever since. When Nicholson's crew pulled the Maverick shell out of the tank, certain sections were left holding almost nothing in the way of real structural steel. The roof, sections of the pillars, Areas that on a stock Maverick would have real, substantial thickness to them had reportedly been thinned down to something that felt, by comparison, closer to aluminum foil than automotive steel. Some who've told the story over the decades swear you could see daylight through sections of the panels if you held them up at the right angle in direct sunlight. Whether every detail of that legend is precisely accurate or has grown slightly with each retelling over 5 decades is almost beside the point. What matters is that the car was light enough and performed differently enough from what a stock-bodied Maverick should have, that it drew real serious attention from NHRA officials during competition. Tech inspectors weighed the car. They remeasured it. They looked it over again, running their hands along panels that felt noticeably different from anything else on the starting line that weekend, exchanging the kind of glances between each other that suggested nobody quite believed what they were feeling under their own fingertips. And here's the part of the story that made it so remarkable on paper. Nothing about the car broke the letter of NHRA's rules. Acid dipping itself wasn't explicitly prohibited. There was no specific minimum thickness written into the rulebook for a body panel, because nobody had anticipated a team pushing the process this aggressively. Officials could look at the car, feel genuinely uneasy about what they were seeing, and still find themselves without a clear technical violation to point to. It was legal in the same way so many of Smokey Yunick's tricks over in NASCAR were legal, not because anyone approved of it, but because nobody had written the specific rule that would have stopped it. Nicholson, whether by design or by simply understanding the rule book better than the people enforcing it, had built a car that sat exactly on the far edge of what officials could actually act on. That gap between "this doesn't feel right" and "this breaks a written rule" is exactly where Nicholson's Maverick lived, and it's exactly the kind of gap that had made drivers like him so valuable to their sport and so frustrating to the officials trying to police it. Word of the inspection reportedly spread through the garage area almost as fast as the car's lap times had. Other crews trading half-whispered versions of the story between rounds, each retelling adding a little more color to a story that was already remarkable enough without any embellishment. By the time the weekend was over, it said that competitors who hadn't even seen the Maverick up close were already repeating the story to friends back home, half rumor and half genuine drag racing history in the making. Number 4. This is where the story becomes less about one car and more about the entire structural problem NHRA faced in policing pro stock during this era. Inspectors had scales. They had basic measuring tools. What they didn't have, in any practical race day form, was a reliable way to test exactly how much material had been removed from a given panel, or to prove that removal had crossed some invisible line from aggressive but legal weight reduction into something that should be disqualified. There was no ultrasonic thickness gauge sitting in an NHRA tech inspector's toolbox in this era. No quick, non-destructive way to measure exactly how many thousandths of an inch of steel remained on a given fender without physically cutting into it. Even if an inspector's gut told them a panel felt wrong, translating that instinct into an enforceable ruling required a standard that simply didn't exist yet in the rulebook. You can't disqualify a car for feeling too light. You need a number, a threshold, a specific measurable violation, and in the early 1970s, NHRA hadn't yet written the kind of minimum thickness or minimum weight per panel rule that would have given officials solid ground to stand on. Without that rule, every conversation between an inspector and a crew chief about a suspiciously light body panel was ultimately just that, a conversation with no enforcement mechanism attached to it. This is precisely the pattern that shows up again and again throughout drag racing's history. A team finds a gap the rulebook never anticipated. They exploit it, aggressively and skillfully, for as long as the gap stays open. Officials feel the effects on the racetrack, the lap times, the launches, the way a car simply performs better than the numbers on paper should allow, long before they have the technical framework in place to actually do something about it. Nicholson's Maverick sat exactly in that uncomfortable middle ground for a stretch of time, competitive, controversial, and functionally untouchable, because NHRA's inspection process hadn't caught up to what its most creative crew chiefs had already figured out how to do, quietly, weekend after weekend. Rival teams, predictably, weren't thrilled about any of this. Watching a competitor's car launch harder and run quicker due to an advantage you couldn't point to on a measuring tape is one of the most frustrating positions a crew chief can be in, worse, in some ways, than losing to a straightforward horsepower advantage, because there's no clear target to chase or catch up to. You can build a bigger engine. It's much harder to build a car around an advantage you can't even fully identify, let alone measure, on a rival's machine. Complaints circulated. Officials paid closer attention to Nicholson's cars at subsequent events, scrutinizing them more heavily than they scrutinized the rest of the field, pulling the Maverick aside almost as a matter of routine by the time word had fully spread through the garage area. But scrutiny alone without a specific rule to enforce only goes so far. You can inspect a car as many times as you want, but if the rulebook gives you nothing to disqualify it on, all that extra scrutiny amounts to little more than making a point. And just like every other loophole in drag racing's long history of clever engineers outrunning cautious rulebooks, this one eventually caught up with the entire sport, not by punishing Nicholson directly, but by forcing NHRA to rewrite the rules for everyone who came after him. Number 5. The practice of acid dipping got a hard, industry-wide second look not long after stories like Nicholson's Maverick started circulating through the garage area and reaching the ears of NHRA's technical officials. Within a few seasons, rules around how much material could legally be removed from a body panel began tightening considerably. Minimum thickness requirements started appearing in the rulebook, giving inspectors an actual measurable standard to enforce instead of relying on a gut feeling about how a panel felt under a thumb. Officials began requiring specific minimum gauge measurements on key body panels, a rule that in a very real sense existed because one Ford Maverick had pushed the previous absence of such a rule to its absolute breaking point. The era of genuinely paper-thin steel bodies, cars that were, in some documented cases, barely holding their shape under their own paint, quietly came to an end as these new standards took hold. It's a familiar arc in this sport's history. A gap gets exploited until it becomes impossible to ignore, and then the rulebook expands to close it permanently for every team that follows, whether they ever intended to push things as far as the car that triggered the change in the first place. Teams that had been dabbling cautiously in acid dipping suddenly found themselves working within hard numerical limits, and the freewheeling judgment call era of the practice effectively ended for good. Nicholson himself never publicly confirmed just how far his own Maverick had actually gone, and in a strange way, that's exactly the point. Officials weren't just worried about what they could prove about one specific car at one specific event. They were worried about what they couldn't prove, and about what would happen to a driver sitting behind a razor-thin steel shell if that car ever met a guardrail or another car at speed. A structurally compromised body isn't just a competitive advantage, it's a genuine safety risk, and that's ultimately what pushed officials to act even without an airtight case against any single car. Safety concerns, in the end, tend to move rulebooks faster than pure competitive grievances ever do. And this was very much a case where the two overlapped completely. What's worth remembering here is that Nicholson wasn't acting in isolation. Acid dipping had become enough of an open practice across pro-stock garages by this point that Nicholson's Maverick, however extreme it may have been, was really just the most visible example of a trend that had been quietly building for seasons across multiple teams and multiple shops. His car became the one people remembered, the one that got told and retold at swap meets and reunions for decades afterward. But the underlying problem, steel bodies pushed further and further towards structural minimums in the chase for a competitive edge, belonged to the entire class, not to one driver alone. In some ways, Nicholson simply had the courage or the recklessness to push the practice further and more publicly than anyone else was willing to, and ended up wearing the reputation for an entire garage area's worth of quiet experimentation. There's also a broader footnote worth including here. Nicholson's reputation as an innovator, built years earlier through his camera-powered factory experimental exploits, meant that when a story like this attached itself to his name, it landed differently than it might have for a less established driver. Fans and rivals alike were almost primed to believe Nicholson capable of exactly this kind of aggressive, boundary-pushing engineering, because he'd already spent a decade proving he was willing to chase every possible advantage the rulebook hadn't explicitly closed off. The Maverick story didn't feel like an outlier in his career. It felt to most people who'd followed him from the camera years onward, like exactly the kind of thing Dyno Don Nicholson would do. And that reputation, built race weekend by race weekend over more than a decade, is exactly why the story still gets told today with a kind of knowing nod rather than genuine disbelief. Of course it was Nicholson. Who else would it have been? There's a pattern that runs through so many of drag racing's most famous stories, and Dyno Don Nicholson's acid-dipped Maverick fits it perfectly. A rule doesn't get written until someone proves, often in the most dramatic way possible, exactly why it needs to exist. Nobody at NHRA sat down years in advance and preemptively wrote a minimum panel thickness into the Pro Stock rulebook. It took a car light enough to make officials stop and physically feel the metal with their own hands before that gap in the rules became impossible to ignore any longer. That's the real inheritance of this story. Every minimum thickness rule written into a modern drag racing rulebook carries a little bit of Don Nicholson's Maverick inside it. Whether the sport wants to acknowledge that lineage or not, he didn't set out to rewrite NHRA's technical inspection process. He set out to build the lightest, fastest car the rules of his era would technically allow, and in doing exactly that, he showed everyone, officials included, precisely where those rules needed to catch up. Somewhere in drag racing history, there's always a car like this one. A car that doesn't break the rules so much as it exposes exactly how far those rules had never been tested. And every single time it happens, the sport comes out the other side a little more carefully written than it was before. A rulebook quietly rebuilt, panel by panel, around whatever the last clever mind managed to get away with first. Dyno Don Nicholson never needed a confession, and he never needed the full story confirmed to secure his place in that history. The car itself, sitting in an inspection bay, while officials ran their hands over steel that shouldn't have felt the way it felt, told the whole story on its own, and 50 years later, it's still telling it, one retelling at a time, in garages and grandstands that have long since forgotten most of the other cars that raced that same weekend.